Hey, now welcome to the show, where the wind's blowing strong and the truth can flow. This is the good oil. Catch a vibe today with Cam Slater leading us all the way.
Simon O'Connor, welcome to the Good Oil podcast.
It's been a while, as in I've been waiting for this invite, but now here it is.
Yeah, well, now you're here, you're going to spill your guts like everybody else does.
Oh, sir, this is an interrogation, not an interview.
Oh, well, it all depends on whether or not I'm wearing a Hugo Boss suit or something like that, yeah.
No, looking forward to it.
It's a bit funny talking to you now that you're an ex-politician about some of the things we want to talk about, but, who is Simon O'Connor? Like, you don't have to make a pitch anymore like at a National Party pre-selection or anything. If people come up to you today in the street and go, well, okay, you're a nice guy, Simon O'Connor. Tell us a bit about yourself. Where would you start?
Well, actually, the paradox is now that I'm out of Parliament, answering these questions is a lot easier. Look, I normally just start by describing myself as a husband, and in my case, a stepfather to five, and a foster carer to one, because, if you were really wanting to reduce me down to who I am, for me, it's about relationships. I just enjoy engaging people, and the most important people in my life are my wife, Rachel, as I say, my 5 stepkids, little foster girl that we look after. Those are probably the most important things. And then probably the secondary side is not even political. I'm a student of philosophy and theology, and I love ideas. I love debating. So people and ideas is who Simon is, if I was to speak about myself in the third person.
Well, it comes across on your Substack with your writing that you actually put a considerable amount of thought into the topics that you want to write about. It really comes through on that, and so that backs up what you're saying with, your keenness around philosophy and things like that.
Well, I try to be. I don't always think I'm necessarily right. I mean, obviously, when I write opinion pieces or do my own podcasts and conversations and talks, I believe in what I'm saying. But the whole point of doing it is to get feedback and to learn and to be challenged. And I just love it, including when I know I've riled people up, and I don't do it deliberately.
It just happens though, doesn't it? I mean, I don't. I do deliberately rile people up because
No way.
because my view is that politics doesn't happen when we all agree, and that politics is the ultimate debate over ideas and philosophy and ideology. But if we shut down debate, then we're not refined. It's the ultimate in scientific method. You try and you try this method, and it's the same in politics. You try this argument and that argument, but we've somehow, through polarization, ended up with 2 camps of people, largely, especially in New Zealand. We've got a blue team and a red team who talk past each other rather than trying to find common solutions.
We do. I mean, you've seen that in recent days with, was it Labour MPs literally swearing and abusing a minister, and it's got worse over the time I was in Parliament. I don't think it was because I was there, but yeah, we are talking past one another, and that ability to discuss and debate has been lost, which is a major problem. So this is why, again, I think things like podcasts, writing on Substacks, I just find it enjoyable and fun. Again, it's a good way to test ideas. And if I might, I'll just pick up on one thing you're saying, because, in my 12 years in Parliament, so many people would come up to me and go, why don't you just work together with the other team? Why don't you just all just be, bipartisan? And you go, well, I don't want to cause fights for no reason.
It's we, isn't it?
It is, but it's also, well, if we all agreed, you no longer have a democracy. That's basically a dictatorship. The disagreements are actually healthy in our environment.
Well, I think the disagreements are healthy. It's the way that you do it. But, just pick some hot topics, like China, for instance. We've got all these ex-prime ministers who are coming out and, they never said these sorts of things when they were prime ministers, but now they're not prime ministers. They're basically has-beens, all coming out, basically tagging off China. And you've got to ask why.
And I don't have all the answers to that. I mean, first and foremost, from Helen Clark to whoever, they're welcome to put their
Helen Clark, Don Brash.
Yeah, I see Jenny Shipley as well was praising President Xi Jinping for being a strategic, what was it? I can't remember the exact word, but praising him. I mean, this is an autocratic dictator of the people of China. And look, I don't know exactly the motivations. Part of it probably is, genuine belief. Some do get sinecures ultimately through board appointments. Others, of course, well, they probably just want to be relevant. But it won't surprise you or anyone who does know me. I've got a real issue with the CCP or the Chinese Communist Party, and I think Helen and crew are completely wrong in what they're saying about how we should relate to China.
It beggars belief that these guys come out and support. I can understand Helen Clark. She's an old school Marxist. She's always towed the commie line in anything. But Don Brash, leader of the National Party, leader of the ACT Party, he should be ideologically and pathologically opposed to a communist dictatorship. The only reason I can see them coming out and saying anything is the same reason why Bob Carr does in Australia, who Winston called Beijing Bob, is that they're being paid. And that's the only reason I can see that they would come out and say those things. Well, obviously, we've got no evidence of that, but surely we'd be entitled to ask the question, are you being paid?
Oh, I think they're appropriate questions. I've actually had quite a few talks to Don around this, and I have actually a lot of respect for him. We very much disagree on this matter. I suspect from someone like Don's side, and I can't speak on his behalf, but I think he fits the camp along with John Key and a few others who say, look, we're aware of the human rights abuses and the terrible things this autocratic regime does, but look, there's nothing we in New Zealand can do about it. And at the end of the day, we do a significant amount of trade, so we want to, protect that. So it's a very, utilitarian argument.
I think it's gay.
It's one that doesn't work with me. I mean, if you wanted to use a different analogy, they're saying, look, we're not going to bother with the human rights records and all the things that China does because New Zealand can't make any difference. Well, New Zealand can't make any difference to climate change, and yet this government and others will tax us somehow to change things. I mean, there's just so much inconsistency. But I will add too, and I've written about it in the past, the use of sinecures by the CCP or its proxies is well known across the Western world. So board appointments or appointments to their academic faculties and so forth, it's a way of maintaining some influence.
So if you look at Jenny Shipley, she's been on the board of a Chinese-owned company. I think she's currently on the board of a Chinese-owned company. Don Brash is on the board of a Chinese bank. Is there money changing hands? Well, yes, at a superficial level, but what people in New Zealand fail to understand is that if there's a Chinese bank operating in New Zealand, it's operating with the express permission of the CCP.
Mm-hmm.
All of its executives, all of its people that are in the senior levels of that bank are senior CCP members. You don't get to be a billionaire or a multimillionaire in China without you scratching the back of the CCP.
Oh, 100%. I think, and I hope listeners don't take this the wrong way, but I generally find New Zealanders, and same in Australia and some other countries, don't quite get the level of control which the CCP has on every aspect.
It's everything.
It's everything. It's all present. You can't even travel on a train. I'm not exaggerating here. They will shut you down if you are a dissident. You can't even access the trains. So, I mean, that's probably a minor example, but the level of control, and you've nailed it. Basically, no one gets into positions of influence, politically or corporate, without the CCP's approval. And that applies here in New Zealand for anyone. If you're in, the student associations, even political life, you are not there without the approval of the CCP at some point. And the other thing, Cam, is people have to understand that literally hundreds of thousands of Chinese communists who are working to try and influence foreign countries like our own.
No, we've got all sorts of associations, in New Zealand, Chinese, friendship societies and things like that. They're all a front for the CCP to plow money into various politicians and mouthpieces in all the political parties, except, I must note, New Zealand First. They don't get any money from the Chinese at all.
Which is a good thing. I mean, it was one of the things that caused a little trouble last year? Whenever the election was on for National, I drew attention to an editor of a Chinese language newspaper in New Zealand who had donated substantial amounts to National. Let's be clear, it's perfectly legal, but when you put it in the wider context, why is it that this is happening from a person who's a vocal mouthpiece? So you did right. A lot of money flows through these associations, not all of them. And we really have to say here, we're talking about the Chinese Communist Party, not the Chinese people in general. The first victims of an autocratic regime are the people themselves.
Well, I mean, I've got a Chinese mate. He comes to a lunch group that we have with the a bunch of blokes from church. If you ask him about, say, Tiananmen Square, he says, well, it's a big place in Beijing, so what about the massacre? What massacre?
Yeah.
They literally don't know because they've never been told.
They've never been told, and then there's a whole other group that it's just a no-go.
Yeah.
And it's been one of the tests I found when I've talked to various people from the Chinese community is to ask them about Tiananmen, often ask them about Hong Kong, and their answers is always very telling. They don't have to be as strident as myself on the topic, but if they're high-level denial or like with Hong Kong, oh no, there was just such violence, we had to step in. It's like, really? That's not the case. But yeah, there's tests there, but the fundamental point, and you've nailed it really well, is ultimately there's a lot of influence and control from the CCP here in New Zealand, particularly through those associations.
It's quite funny too when you're talking about social issues with them. My mate, he was saying, "Oh, what is this trans thing? I don't understand the trans thing." I said, "Well, it's where a girl or a boy says that they're the opposite, that they're a boy or a girl." I said, "Does that happen in China?" He went, "No, not permitted."
No. But I mean, it's utterly different worlds. I mean, sometimes when we get caught up in a lot of these cultural issues here in New Zealand, again, it's in a lot of Western countries, it's just complete anathema or foreign in these other places. They just don't.
They don't understand.
They don't understand it, and it's not just that they don't want to talk about it. They genuinely just that they don't understand it. It's just you can't even understand biology. It's just not a question. As I've travelled a bit since Parliament, again, these are not the topics which people are discussing. So we get very obsessed with them here in New Zealand.
We get obsessed with tiny, tiny, tiny minority positions on things that are blown out of proportion. The trans issue is a case in point. I mean, what's the level of people who are gay or part of the rainbow community in New Zealand? It's got to be no more than 5% of the population, and the trans part of that equation of the alphabet soup of the various identities is a tiny, tiny percentage. You're probably talking less than 1,000 people in the entire country, and yet we've got these corporates and political parties bending over backwards to contort the language. A case in point, David Farrow is hopelessly politically correct sometimes. He's a dear mate. I've known him for
David's great.
years and years and years, but he writes this article about the situation of the young girl who died in hospital.
Oh, Vanessa.
Yeah. And in his entire little article he's writing, he's going they, and so he's enabling that delusion and trying not to upset the more left-wing people who read his website. I mean, there's a reason why we call him Pinko, but...
Okay, well, I didn't know that. I didn't know that. I had to know what my nicknames of people are. But I mean, look, New Zealand, I think we always try to be too nice. And so we just don't want to cause a fight. And so we keep acquiescing or giving in to these.
Go along
groups.
To get along, I call it.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. I mean, my encouragement to people is don't fall, particularly for the language tricks. It's one of the first, if you will, dark arts of politics, is to try and manipulate the use of language, be it like you are with gender, or you take words like, I don't know, compassion and empathy, or dare I mention the K word, kindness, and contorting.
Don't mention that.
I know, you sort of get a chill when I hear that word these days. So
that's when the jackboots and the marching and the batons and the tear gas starts, when kindness is meant.
Oh, I still Bob as in McCoskrie, who I work with, and one of my clients, he showed me a video of Jacinda talking to Oprah the other day, and I just about did my head in, talking about kindness and the use of fear and how terrible it was. It was like, look in the mirror, woman, look in the mirror.
Yeah, well, she probably looks in the mirror and sees a world leader.
Oh, spare me.
I mean, she's got complete narcissistic personality disorder, I'm absolutely certain. The psychotic ways that she manipulated society in New Zealand, and then she sits there and says, oh, this is all bad, and I didn't do any of that.
Oh, I think the dissonance or the disconnect is phenomenal, but I'd also argue it was also quite calculated. A lot of what happened in the COVID years, all that behavioral theory and psychology, it was at times hard to see it all clearly when you were in that sort of milieu or mess, but it's really, really clear now. And again, the inability to even reflect on that is just astounding.
Let's just touch on that. I know that you were opposed to a lot of the COVID regulations, lockdowns, the silliness of the masks, and the forced vaccinations. despite Christopher Hibkins lying to us and saying no one was forced to take the
Oh, that was
vaccine.
completely a lie.
Yeah, it's like Jacinda Ardern when she said, "I've never told a lie in politics." Well, that was a lie when she
That's right.
when she said that. But I know that you were quietly vocal, I'll say. But when all those protesters tipped up on the front lawn of Parliament, tell us about the discussions that went on inside the National Party about that, because I was astonished that not a single sitting MP would come out and speak to the protesters.
Yeah, and I mean, it's a really good question, one that I've been
Mm.
asked quite a few times. I mean, where to even start with it? Look, definitely someone who was very hesitant and concerned, both from the medical, the philosophical, and the social side of
And freedoms
freedom.
perspectives.
Well, one of the things I keep saying is our human rights. So your right for your bodily integrity, right to health care or health choices, your freedom of speech, freedom of association. These are fundamental human rights. Um, and they exist for the bad times. You don't need human rights, if you will, when everything's going well. You and I don't need freedom of speech per se if it's all happy and agreeing. You need it when things are going bad. And in COVID, things were going bad. And our human rights got tossed out the window. All of them. I remember questioning Andrew Little at the time around freedom of religion, which is enshrined in our Bill of Rights,
Mm.
was not even looked at when officials were discussing their policies. One entire freedom ignored.
Well, it was more than one entire freedom. You had you had supposedly in our Bill of Rights Act, and this is the bit that really grinds my gears, is that when the Bill of Rights Act was passed, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but I'm pretty sure that it was Geoffrey Palmer that pushed that
I
through,
think that's right.
is it wasn't made the primary act of Parliament that all other acts of Parliament should refer to. It was a nice to have. It's nice to have these things, but, if the government of the day decides that it wants to totally ignore it, well, they're perfectly entitled to, and that's where it all goes wrong.
Yep. Yeah, it's not. The Bill of Rights in New Zealand is not the equivalent, as you know, of the Bill of Rights in the likes of the United States, a simple majority. And so governments, doesn't matter if it's the blue team or the red team,
They're all as bad as each other.
in many ways are always breaking and going over ORA or the Bill of Rights Act, time and time again. And certainly in COVID, all the rights got affected. My comment on the religious one, it wasn't even mentioned. Now, I'm not saying that's the most important. Look, there were
Well, they're all important, and you're right, they were just tossed aside, and when people went to court and pointed out that this was against the Bill of Rights, the judges all basically said, "Oh, yes, but. Oh, yes, but it's okay to ignore the Bill of Rights in a medical emergency like this." Well, we all know now that it wasn't the emergency we were told it was going to be.
Yeah.
It didn't even come close to the R factors that they were talking about, that all of the modeling was bullshit. And we're led down the garden path by a bunch of professional liars.
and fear. Fear upon fear was visited on people. I remember giving some speeches on the House on that. For me, it was trying to push the barrow out as far as I felt I could and to put it down to sort of, I hope it doesn't come across as too mercenary to people, but had I spoken, in my estimation, much more loudly, um, boldly, had I stepped out onto the forecourt as I'd have preferred to have done, for me, it would have been a short-term win and a long-term loss in terms of consequences. So that moderated a lot of my behavior, and I suspect others. And what I mean by that is I think my political career would have been over. Now, as time's gone on,
Hindsight's 20/20.
I know, hindsight, can do things differently. But at the time, and I suspect it was for most, not all, but most of the MPs were trying to weigh up what was the appropriate thing to do. And I know, I won't mention names and I won't break too many confidences, but long and short, there were certainly a group of us in National, not a large group, but talked quite frequently about going out, together, standing together. But that was sitting within this wider dynamic within the Parliament of our political leadership in all the parties, right up to the Speaker saying, don't. So sort of don't break ranks. So that comes with an even greater consequence.
So when you think about that for a minute and put it into context, we had a bunch of teenagers turn up on the forecourt of Parliament wanting a ban on oil and gas exploration in New Zealand. And Jacinda Ardern went out, stood there, and announced right there and then in front of everybody that was indeed what was going to happen. You had a bunch of rowdies making demands and the Prime Minister acquiescing to those. And yet we had some thousands of people, tens of thousands of people, who justifiably were angry about where they'd landed with all of these COVID restrictions and everything. And Jacinda Ardern has said recently on a podcast that it was all because of Russian disinformation, without actually showing us the proof of this Russian disinformation, that somehow that these tens of thousands of New Zealanders were hoodwinked into marching on Parliament and setting up a camp. But anyway, they turned up there and the edict came down from above. No one's to go and mention them. No, meet them, talk to them, do anything.
That's pretty much it. I mean, there's a few nuances around that. I mean, the security services and others were advising, as far as I understand it, the Speaker and the party leaders, like, this is dangerous, etc., etc. So long and short, there was a massive, I was going to say it's a wall, probably the wrong image, but maybe it isn't. Long and short, it was a massive wall that was being put around the MPs verbally to say, just do not do this. And so could we have jumped over it to sort of extend the analogy? Absolutely. But I think for myself, and I suspect for a lot of colleagues, it would just, would have been a blaze of glory, if you will, and people would have been probably very grateful. And then we would have been absolutely dead in the water for all and everything. And, speaking for myself personally, been able to continue to talk and challenge and write and give my speeches in Parliament on COVID and other issues that I've spoken about since then, I wouldn't have had the opportunity. So I think that was a big, big part of it. But, I think it remains an exceptionally, if not shameful, sad circumstance, because they were good people. I met a number of the protesters or those in Parliament off-site, because they were walking down Lambton Quay or the terrace, and lots of were constituents or people I knew or people who knew me. So again, the idea, and it was propaganda, that these were all dangerous people was completely and utterly wrong.
Totally wrong. I mean, I was there on the outside, getting bombarded with, basically sound torture from the Speaker, from Trevor Mallett. Playing all of these songs and things like that, disrupting people's sleep. And the days that I was there, I saw nothing but a cohesive society who were there for one aim, is to make the politicians listen. And I guess ultimately the protesters succeeded, because shortly after that protest, the mandates came off. The wheels started falling off all of the narrative. And
court cases started going against the government.
Yeah, the court cases were going against the government significantly. And ultimately they won, the protesters, despite all the violence. And the only people who brought violence to that protest were the police. There was no violence until they turned up in their riot gear.
It certainly changed at the end. I was actually out of town when it was all going down. I think there was genuinely a change in some who were there, but there's been, I think, real mistruths. Oh, it sounds like who uses mistruths?
Well, but there were, because the police, I remember the day before it was all broken up, the police were saying, it's very dangerous right now. We've seen people with pitchforks and things like that. Now, when the police raid a gang house or they raid some drug dealers or something like that, they always display all the weaponry that they've found, right? They line it all up and they take photos of all the cash and the drugs and all the weaponry. Well, after the end of the protest, when it's been cleared and they've basically dispossessed the dispossessed of their meager possessions, did we see a lineup of machetes and pitchforks and all the things they said that were there? Surely they would have, shown up that. But they didn't. We didn't see anything other than everything being picked up and put in skips.
What they really were doing was trying to conflate the protesters in general and the small cadre of troublemakers who came at the end, the ones that you did see breaking up cobbles and throwing them at.
The police were throwing the cobbles back at them.
Oh,
it's on video, plain as day.
I said I wasn't. Part of me obviously doesn't want to be right in the middle of it, but wasn't actually in Parliament at the time. I was back up in Auckland for something, so I was watching it on TV. But one thing that's always struck me is, again, how they've tried to conflate what happened at the end with everything that happened before. But I don't think it's succeeded in New Zealand's general populace. I think most people understood and still understand what the protest was about, and they know that the protest was not about how it concluded.
No, it most certainly wasn't. But, I was interested to know what went on in that caucus room, in the National Party's caucus room.
Lots of discussion is the long and the short of it, but as is known too, the party leaders across the parties were united and we're not going out. And I suppose I've forgotten who I was saying it to on another, might have been on a radio chat. Long and short, of course, is the longer the time went on between the protest starting and MPs not going out, the cost of going out to the MPs got higher and higher and higher. It would have become even more bold with even more consequences.
So I said in my chats with various MPs in different parties when this was going on, I said, for God's sake, get out there with a tent, set it up on the forecourt, invite the leaders. I'll tell you who you need to invite them, sit there for 2 or 3 hours having a discussion. Doesn't matter if you get a bit heated, but have a damn discussion. If you do that, the protest will end.
Oh, I completely agree. And then obviously, as someone who didn't go out, people can make their comments on that, can make comments on anything. But it would have diffused a lot of the.
Yeah.
And you know what?
People just wanted to be heard.
They did. Oh, and that was very clear. It was very clear. But as I say, when the structures kick around, so is it all the party leaders, the speaker, the security services, and I would argue the mainstream or legacy media as well was just singing the same narrative. It became an exceptionally fraught situation for the MPs, which is ultimately why no one went out. Not formally. And again, I'm not trying to take away from that lack of people turning out. But a number of us were still able to have some conversations. But it wasn't that powerfully symbolic action of actually being on the forecourt and saying, we're here at your House of Representatives to listen.
Well, I mean, that's the thing. Those people were all voters. And ultimately, it was the end of Ardern, in 2023. It was it, all over. Good night.
Oh, she completely overcooked things. In those early days and weeks, personally, I think it was relatively well handled. I often would say, what would it have been like to sit in that cabinet room with all this information coming and trying to work on something unprecedented, or relatively unprecedented. But as time went on, it just got more and more controlling, more and more desperate, and actually just more and more wrong, legally, morally, philosophically, medically.
Yeah, so people would say to me, "Oh, if National had been in government then instead of Ardern, things would have gone differently." And I say to them, "Well, that you don't actually understand how it works in Parliament. Yes, you might be the Prime Minister or the Health Minister, whatever, but the people, you don't know everything, and you are relying on officials who also don't know everything, but you're relying on them to know more than you know." And so it's a game of who knows the most.
Yep.
And how quickly they can get that information together. And I argue that if Bill English had won in the 2017 election, he would have done exactly the same thing that Jacinda Ardern did, at least in the initial phases of it, because that's what Ashley Bloomfield and all of those professional liars in the Ministry of Health, that's what they would have advised, and he would have done it.
I think you're right. I mean, it's a hypothetical. I think National would have done it differently, but not dramatically. I think you're probably right about the start. They would have it was a vacuum, and you would have had to rely, as you say, on the officials. I think after that, things would have changed. It doesn't mean it would have been great and perfect and, skipping in flowery meadows, but I think the importance of the economy and freedoms would have been better respected. But again, I don't want to try and gild the lily here and say it would have just been dramatically wonderful. I think, human nature is what it was. Political power is what it was. The use of fear is known across all political parties. So yeah, it would have been different, but perhaps not dramatically so.
Yeah, and just looking at the actions of David Seymour, although he only had a few MPs at that stage, this was a libertarian party where freedom is at the core of their supposed classical liberal values. And yet here he was in lockstep pretty much with everything Ardern did, including not speaking to the protesters. And that for me was a bitter disappointment to see, and someone who loftily explains that this is about freedom and equality and all those sorts of things just went out the window.
I was surprised by that. I'm not here to throw particular stones at David,
No,
because
I
it
can
goes
do that.
across all the parties. But yeah, you would expect a libertarian, But I mean, I would argue ACT is only a convenient libertarian party. Some of its policies are, but when it doesn't suit, does something else. It's quite confused. And the other side of it too is he's one of only a couple of MPs. You don't have that wider party dynamic to come thumping down on you. In other words, if he'd gone out, I mean, who's going to tell him off apart from himself in that party
Yeah,
context?
well, what could Trevor Mallard have actually done that other than give Seymour a platform if he had placed sanctions on him for going against the Speaker's wishes or whatever? Well, if a righteous politician would have gone out there, done that, copped the sanctions, and then spoken very loudly about how wrong that was.
I can't speak, I'll personalize it. I think it was more, for someone like myself, I wasn't aware of any particular sanctions that could be applied. It was more that you were going to get beaten to a pulp figuratively, better say that really clearly, figuratively, by your colleagues, your party leadership, and the media. You would not have been praised. You would have been just absolutely vilified. Look, I remember the media, New Zealand Herald in particular, outing about my vaccination status. So I was holding very strongly to a position that it's none of your business. None of the public's business. I don't walk around asking people on the street, what drugs they're on. So I just was not responding. And the media were hounding MPs for their vaccination status. And they did, I think it was a front page or wherever it was. They outed myself and a couple of others who they didn't know. Some had refused the vaccine. Some were just not prepared to talk about it. That day, I have never copped so much abuse. And here I'm not looking for sympathy or anything. It's just an insight to the dynamic. The abuse, particularly from constituents, you're trying to kill us. And it's like, well, probably easier ways.
Easier ways of giving you a cold.
Exactly right. It was like, oh, good. But it was just the opprobrium, the emotive fear of people on something as relatively simple as that. And I think it's analogous to what MPs were thinking, that we're going to get no sympathy from the media at all for going out. You would not have been put in any.
You know where you find sympathy, don't you?
On the good oil?
No, in the dictionary.
Oh, right. Yes, this wasn't paid.
It's in the dictionary, and it's between shit and syphilis. That's where sympathy's rated for everybody. But you're right. There was this ridiculous behavior that if you didn't take a experimental gene therapy, you were trying to kill everybody, and that it was a disease. I mean, the lines. It was a disease of the unvaccinated. Yeah, until the vaccinated started getting sick as well.
It's the irrationality of the whole dynamic which worries me. I suppose it's very human. We go back to base instincts, but the irrationality of how collectively society approach this is worrying, and why it potentially can happen again if we don't learn the lessons. I should just add, everything I'm saying here is not trying to justify decisions or not, but just trying to give a bit of an insight into sort of the thinking at the time.
Yeah, that's right. That's what I'm trying to understand. I was looking at the whole situation from the perspective of my visit to Israel in 2014, right? So I had always wondered all of my youth, because I've been a student of history forever, and I always wondered why the Jews of Europe didn't fight back, that they blithely walked off the train down the platform into the gas chambers. And I never could work it out until I went to Yad Vashem and went through the Holocaust Museum there, which takes you on the literal journey.
It's very affecting.
And I came out of that place in tears. And, I can be a crier at times, but to see how it was incremental. It was one step at a time. The Holocaust didn't start with the gas chambers. It started with, you need to wear a gold star. And here we were learning nothing from history in the COVID times of demonizing a particular part of society, making those people in society identify themselves, then shunning them, preventing them from operating businesses or getting haircuts or doing what it was very visceral for me, just a few short years after I'd been through Yad Vashem, to see the same tactics being deployed on our society, and 90% of society tugging their forelocks and going, yes, sir.
We're the same human beings today as we are of history. So those same tactics apply. The Holocaust is a very unique event, but for me, you've touched, I was at Yad Vashem a few months ago now. It is
You
very.
know what I'm talking
I
about.
do, and it's going to be potentially hard to explain to people. But as Cam, you were saying, you are literally being walked through the museum. You can't just go into a big room. It's a
It's a
serious room.
one-way. It's a one-way tour through. You enter, and the only way you get out is the same way that everybody got out at the end of the war. They walk you through these galleries, and at every crossroad, there's like 2 halls of galleries with bridges in between them. And each one of those bridges is the act of Parliament or the act of the Nazi state that enacted the next part of. And you go into the hall and you saw the results of what that was.
And as you intimated, it's that slow build. I mean, fundamentally, it's about scapegoating people. It's making
Yes.
them other, and that was very clearly a tactic here in New Zealand. Still used. Oh, don't listen to that group. They're not really like us. Yeah, very, very dangerous mindset, and it's been in humanity for a long time. Yeah, with the Holocaust, though, it's a unique moment. I get very frustrated, not in this conversation, but in wider conversation, when people just keep throwing the word Holocaust around. Because as you saw with Yad Vashem, what we know in history, this was organized, this was systematic, and had it been allowed to go on for longer, would have been total. I mean, it's just chilling. There's they call it the coffin map in parts of Europe, where a coffin is drawn on states like, think of Lithuania, Estonia, and Poland, with the numbers killed. And one says in German, Judenfrei, Jew-free. I mean, this was total and horrifying. And we said never again. And yet
it's happening.
And yet here we are in modern Western societies discussing the viability and the place of the Jewish people in the world. I mean, it's just, for me, it's beyond crazy, but that's humanity for you.
Well, that brings us to the Middle East conflict, and you've taken a similar stance to myself on that. I see a lot of comment out there, and as soon as you intimate that you support Israel's position of the right to exist, the right to defend its population from attack, the right to defend itself, you're all of a sudden called a Zionist. And I get and I know I don't mind being called a Zionist. I believe in the right of the state of Israel to exist. It is a United Nations recognized country.
New Zealand recognized it.
New Zealand recognized it, in 1948. And yet we're now being told by people that we shouldn't have these beliefs, that Israel has a right to exist. We're told by the Green Party that from the river to the sea, from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, Palestine shall be free. That means the annihilation of the Israeli state. And it's like they use Zionist as a word to get them off. I mean, I look at it this way. They say you're a Zionist, which is telling us that they hate Jews without telling us they hate Jews, because they can't say I hate Jews. They say, oh, so you're a nasty Zionist.
It's that word manipulation that we were talking earlier. A lot of effort's gone into demonizing that word. And Zionism, I don't use it myself. I don't know exactly why. But I believe, like you, that Israel has the right to exist. I was there, as you know, recently. It's a vibrant, thriving liberal democracy. That doesn't mean that everything it chooses to do is right, in the same way that just because
they're not appalling arguments with each other, but they're arguments.
Oh, they are.
You've got the hostage families who are impeccably opposed to Israel prosecuting the war to the complete annihilation of Hamas.
Huge.
They want their people back, and rightly so. I understand the emotion of having your child kidnapped by terrorists, and whatever they're going through there is appalling. But they have arguments. They have discussions, and they're vehement discussions.
They are. I mean, that's not an argument around
liberal democracy.
It is. Ask a question and get multiple questions in return. Yeah, I mean, amongst the striking things of that trip was, that Israel is a deeply multicultural society. I mean, one of the things the Greens and others down here trying to make it out as some sort of white nation, like in terms of literally turn it into a color.
Use the word apartheid when they're talking about it as apartheid state.
Go to Tel Aviv. I'm the one who looks odd. I probably looked odd at the best of times, but it's a broad, vibrant society, a free and open media. They have fierce arguments about the nature of the war. They have fierce arguments about the nature of Netanyahu. I went to what is called Hostages Square, where those families are. Absolutely, they want the war to stop no matter what. You talk to some others, and they can be Arab Israelis, Jewish Israelis, or Druze. It's a small religious sect or group. Long and short, others are saying, well, look, if we don't stop Hamas now completely, this will just repeat itself in 5 or 10 years.
Mm.
And you've nailed it. I mean, they say the river to the sea, they mean the complete eradication. It's almost a religious call. They genuinely believe they have to rid the Middle East of every Jew, and they've done it in pretty much every other country, of course, except Israel itself.
Yeah, I mean, there used to be something like 100,000 Jews living in Egypt. There's now 100. There's none in Syria. There's none in Jordan. None in Lebanon. Anywhere in the Middle East where Jews lived and existed as part of society have been expunged.
Well, look
And-
what
and-
happened in the West. Canada is one of the, Australia as well, but Canada is a horrific example of, Jewish homes and businesses being targeted. We've been here before. And, anti-Semitism is the canary in the coal mine. And I completely agree with the likes of Niall Ferguson and Douglas Murray and others who are saying it won't just stop with the Jews. Like, it's where it starts, but those pushing these radical revolutionary ideas will want to come for other groups in society too. It should chill people to the bone to understand what's happening.
like you, I've been to the Gaza envelope, very close to the border of Gaza in Sderot. I actually went to the police station where they had the museum of all of the items that Hamas had repurposed for rockets and that. Now, that police station no longer exists. It was burnt to the ground in the invasion on October 7. Some of the kibbutzes that I went to alongside the border, when I say alongside the border, I mean right next to the border, pretty much wiped out. It's shocking to be that close and realizing what those Israelis lived with on a day-to-day basis. They had bomb shelters in their houses, especially close to the border.
Mm-hmm.
Those bomb shelters were not safe rooms.
No.
So they protect you from bombs and mortars and things like that, which is alarming at the best of times when they're coming at you. And I was there in 2014 and they were coming at me at that time. It's frightening from a New Zealand perspective. Fortunately, I've been underneath artillery and things like that before, so I kind of know what it's like. But most Kiwis don't understand what that's like. But you saw the devastation up close.
Yeah.
How did that affect you?
Quite deeply, actually. I suppose it was just insightful. I mean, emotionally, it's quite difficult. Look, I've been to war zones before. I've been in Iraq. I've been in Afghanistan. Not serving or fighting. Let's make that underline. You're going as a politician to observe, but been to war zones. So it's not unfamiliar. But I went to, for example, Kibbutz Neroz, right on the border, possibly one that you've been to. I mean, these were settlements that used to bring Gazans in to help them work, to try and actually, they say, to try and facilitate peace. One of the residents of Neroz used to go to the border each week and bring Gazan children out with approval to send them to hospitals and back. He was murdered on October 7. But you go through, and the Israelis have left the kibbutz as it is, and burnt out, devastated. I mean, I put pictures up online,
Yeah.
but the one that's the most affecting, I'm pleased you mentioned the shelters. They have shelters in every Israeli home for ballistic missiles. It's what's providing some, just underline that word, some protection at the moment with the Iranian.
Same with
That
the
is
bus
right.
shelters. The bus shelters are all bomb shelters.
Exactly right. Exactly right. But what was striking is they don't have door locks, so they never expected the invasion through the border. And the most affecting moment for me was a safe room where there's 3 Kalashnikov rounds right where the door handle is, because on the other side, the guy was holding the door handle to protect his family. And of course, had to let go, and then you can step in and see exactly where they all died. It was brutal. And that's the other thing too. If you've seen some of the footage, and I don't encourage people to do so, but it was brutal. This wasn't just killing someone. I mean, it's bad enough. It was brutal. And the last point you mentioned, Sderot, near there is the car, all the burnt out cars. Now, the cars don't get burnt out because you fire Kalashnikov rounds. They were burnt out because Hamas and the Gazans came over with accelerant. Not only did they want to kill those
They
Jews,
wanted to erase
they
them.
wanted to erase them. And I think that in itself is quite chilling and should be telling as well. The flip side, standing right on the border, like you've been around artillery fire and you see it going over. Gaza ain't looking hot at all. You know, the building that I was looking at, next minute gone. That's destruction and death as well. But, you know, they are suffering terribly. But I think we're all faced with the question, what is the solution? Because your Chloe Strawbucks and others can, you know, cosplay with their scarves and make these chants. And I would argue, Cam, I'm sorry to be on a bit of a soapbox, they're projecting their own issues into the Palestinian people. You know, all their guilt around New Zealand's colonialism is why they project it onto Israel. But what is actually the solution? Because we can rend our garments about the war. We can rightly be sad about the horrendous deaths on all sides. And without doubt, tens of thousands of people in Gaza have died. But what's the solution? What's the actual solution? Because if you just say, "Oh, let's just forget about it," Hamas,
they're not going to forget.
They're not going to forget. They're going to keep coming.
Their charter.
It is.
Hezbollah's charter is the same.
Exactly.
The Houthis are the same. You can't negotiate with people that have as their core belief that Jews are evil and need to be wiped from the earth.
And the West, I would add too. They just. It's a level of hatred, and it was the word I use or phrase is collective trauma. That was my takeaway in general from the time in Israel. There's a collective trauma on the people there because they know Hamas had more time, and Hezbollah hadn't been taken out by that Mossad operation with the pages. These guys would wipe out every single person, and there's no exaggeration on that for anyone listening. They would kill every one of them, and then they'd come after the next group. Christians ain't going to fare so well. Atheists ain't going to fare so well. These guys are fanatics.
This is what the West has failed to understand, right? And we see this with, Winston's a mate, but on this issue, he's poorly advised by MFAT and keeps on banging on about a two-state solution. Now, after being there, and I know with my contacts that are in the region, that a two-state solution is now permanently, forever off the table as far as Israel is concerned. They've had enough. And I knew that within 48 hours of October 7 that they've had enough. And I said to a few people who are asking me what, because they call me and say, what's going on up there? And so they've had enough. And they're just stabilizing the situation from the invasion. But when the IDF gets moving, you aren't going to stop them, and no politician in Israel will stop them, and they will annihilate Hamas. And they've had enough, and when they're finished with Hamas, they're going to turn on to Hezbollah, and when they're finished with them, they'll turn on Iran. And what I said over a year ago is now pretty much played out. Hamas is, all intents and purposes, dead. There's a few left, but Israel's not going to entertain a two-state solution of the enemy being able to arm themselves and do those sorts of things. Hezbollah, they decapitated the top 4,000 people, literally, with the pages, an incredible intelligence operation. And now they've decapitated the Iranian regime, and which has been shown to be impotent. Yes, they've got a few missiles, but apparently they've got an arsenal of something like 4,000 missiles, but they only can shoot about 100 at a time, and yet 2 or 3 get through, but it isn't, swarms of missiles and drones that are attacking Israel, and Israel is now flying around Tehran with gay abandon, unable to be touched.
Yeah, I mean, Israel has degraded Iran's air defenses. I mean, you have to...
And leadership.
Oh, and leadership. Oh, absolutely. I mean, they've just taken out, they took out one of the head commanders on the first day of strikes, and then 4 days later, they was taken out as replacement. So
then the replacement was taken out, and now they're on to the fourth one of that, the chief of staff of the IRGC.
Yeah.
Gone.
Which should be a terrorist organisation. Another failure here in New Zealand across governments that we haven't designated the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps a terrorist regime. And they operate here in New Zealand as well, harassing our Iranian diaspora. I mean, look, there's so much in that. I mean, look, first and foremost, I take no pleasure in the death, destructions. And
Nobody
war.
does.
No one does. But we also have to live in a real world. And at the end of the day, someone like Iran, they're the ones funding the Hamases and the Houthis and the Hezbollah and others. You've got to ask, why do they have thousands of missiles? Iran has more missiles than just about every NATO country, possibly except America. So they've got more missiles than the
If you
UK
look-
and all of that.
And if you look
Why?
at their order, you look at their order of battle, and it gives you a hint. If you look at their army, and on the surface, it looks like one of the world's largest armies, certainly in the top 10. But you look at their equipment, most of their tanks are either M48 patterns or M60 tanks. This is 1960s technology that they've still got deployed. They've got T-72s from Russia,
Sure.
but T-72s, we all know from the Gulf War and in Ukraine, T-72s don't last that long on a modern battlefield where there's air superiority.
Oh, which is what, Israel's used in the past. I'm no expert on that front. I'm aware of some of it. But no, Iran is not as strong. I mean, was it a couple of years ago when there were the big Mahsa Amini or Woman Life Freedom protests in Iran? Of course, it spread across the world. The regime was shown to be quite weak then. So, it does look like a regime change happening here at the moment. Coming back to the two-state solution, I find it naive of New Zealand to talk about it. I'm disappointed when Luxon or Winston or anyone in government or MFAT is talking about a two-state solution. It can't be on the table anymore. I mean, it might come back in generations to come, but how do you reward a terrorist regime like Hamas with a state? I mean, that's what they're effectively offering. And again, I just use that.
Qatar's not that much better.
No, well, they attacked and butchered each other. These are not democratic nations. You're going to create potentially a pariah state. And again, I use that word naivety, but we seem to keep falling into that here in New Zealand, and I get very frustrated when they use it. I mean, they're welcome to, but when they're using these phrases to go, really, you don't understand what's going on. And someone said to me the other day, and I won't say who, but I thought it was very insightful. New Zealand no longer seems to be able to tell between who are the good guys and the bad guys. Even what's happening now with Iran, it's obvious Iran's the bad guy. These are a theocratic, autocratic regime
who rule by fear and violence.
By violence, who are just about to have nuclear capabilities. And New Zealand's going, well, we don't really like what's happening. Could you be a bit more condemnatory?
Okay.
Could you support Israel's right to... Even Mark Carney, the new liberal...
Woke as hell.
...is condemning Iran, saying they cannot have the bomb and saying Israel has the right to defend itself.
See, I had a discussion with somebody yesterday. They called me up and said, Cam, what you got to understand is the Jews are lying to you. Well, as soon as he said that, I knew that everything else that was going to come out of his mouth was bullshit. But he started talking about, we need to have peace and we need to have this. And I said, yeah, well, we do. We'd like to have peace. I want to have peace. Israel wants to have peace. Israel isn't attacking Iran for no reason. They go, but they've been saying that Iran's going to have the bomb for 30 years. I said, yes. And every time they get close to it, the Israelis find some way of making sure they don't. And he was saying to me, like what? And this is the problem that you have with a lot of these people. They're very low information. And they don't understand that it was the IDF and their Unit 8200 that developed the Stuxnet virus, which was again an intelligence operation where they infiltrated the manufacturer of those centrifuges, which they need to purify the uranium, and inserted a virus into that, which meant that the centrifuges were unstable and they couldn't spin them up and they couldn't do everything. And they ran that operation. Then there was the operation where the Israelis and Mossad stole all of the documents out of Tehran and destroyed the backups of them on how to do all of this.
Took out the nuclear scientists.
And took out the head guy, and he was under close guard. They had a remote-controlled machine gun built into the chassis of a truck left on the side of the road. At every step of the way, when the Iranians have looked like they're getting closer and closer to having the nuclear weapons, the Israelis have acted to ensure that they don't.
And they have to. It's an existential threat. And I mean, I've had debates with different people who are saying, well, why shouldn't Iran be allowed
Well,
this?
Iran says, their supreme leaders say, we're going to wipe Israel off the map.
Mhm.
They're 2,000 miles away. The only way they can wipe Israel off the map is with nuclear weapons.
Yes. Oh, they've delighted. I think it was a former Iranian president says that only one bomb's really needed because it's such a thin and small land. I mean, again, I think people need to understand just how obsessed Iran's leadership, and then we have to make that distinction because, of course, the Iranian people want to be free of these lunatics. But there is just no way that these theocratic nuts can be allowed to have a nuclear bomb. And that's why all the G7 have said that they cannot be allowed to have the bomb.
Even the cheese-eating surrender monkeys of France.
Well, even Macron and that. I mean, but New Zealand, we are naive. I mean, some will call it an independent foreign policy. I just see us drifting around. And again, if we can't distinguish between good and bad, we're in trouble as a country.
I mean, when you see Christopher Luxon come out and, only's asked a question from a patsy journalist with an axe to grind, so what are you going to do about Netanyahu now that warrants have been issued from, basically a kangaroo court with no real jurisdiction anywhere in the world? And he comes out and says, oh, we'll arrest him. I mean, did nobody tell him the implications of saying that out loud?
Doubly so when we have actually friendly diplomatic relations with
Yeah.
Israel. No, I thought again that was naive. It was wrong. It was unnecessary. It was just not needed, and we're not going to arrest him. I was struck that soon after he's having photos shaking the hands of Xi Jinping, who is a brutal autocratic dictator. He's been happy to talk and meet with the Qatari prime minister, and we all know the problems with Qatar. So it's also highly selective. And in some ways, Cam, it's possibly trying to choose sides. And I like a little bit more courage from this government to actually stand up for issues.
We used to be able to pick right from wrong.
Good.
That's what you said, that we seem to. It's like that old skit, with two Nazis standing there listening to, and one of them goes, are we the baddie?
Are we the bad
Are
guys?
we the bad guys? Yeah.
Yeah, it's the British comedians. I can see their faces, but yeah, we should be able to tell right from wrong, and we should be able to take some positions. It doesn't necessarily even have to be, we'd prefer it to be the positions that I think you and I hold, but we have this, I'm going to use the word vacuous, this sort of blobby, no real commitment, if anything, leaning into what the mainstream media and the protesters want. And you go, well, how is that a decent position? And it gets noticed, by the way. I still keep my interests
It
in
does
foreign
get
affairs. They do
noted,
get noticed out of
and
these.
the politicians might not think it does, but it does, which is why Helen Clark keeps piping up and giving us her opinion. Her opinion ceased to be relevant in 2008. Right? Why she doesn't shut up and go quietly away and shuffle off the stage is beyond me. I think she might have attention deficit disorder or something like that. She needs to have the attention. But the media run to her to get some sort of quote about how it's terrible that this government's not making announcements that are in line with her political ideology.
Oh, I think that's a big part of it. In fact, I'm sure you've talked about this a lot. I mean, mainstream and legacy media are very selective of who they do and do not talk to. There are loads of other voices out there with a contrary view to Helen and other signatories to that ad. Academics, former diplomats, obviously people like myself, they just don't talk to us. So people just need to, this is why Good Oil and other things are needed, because you've got to get a broader set of news, because basically legacy media will not tell you a whole lot of things. I only give you that one perspective.
90% of the media identify as left-wing.
Oh, yeah. Self-identified.
Self-identify as left-wing. They tell us if someone says they're a boy or a girl, they believe them. We're told that if a woman makes allegations of sexual impropriety, believe them. And so, when the Ayatollahs and the mad mullahs of Iran say they want to blow Israel up, we should believe them. And when the media tell us that they're left-wing, believe them.
Well, it goes with any autocratic grace. I mean, the Iranian situation is complicated even further with their religious fanaticism. But I remember saying to colleagues days before, in fact, I think I even gave a speech in the House. It was around Xi Jinping's threatening Taiwan, and it was when Putin was building up his forces for Ukraine. And a lot of colleagues, not all, were like, oh, no, he's just building up his capacity. It's saber rattling. And I said exactly that. when autocrats and dictators tell you what they're going to do, you believe them. And I still remember texting some colleagues on that. Was it the February 26th, whatever the day was the invasion, 4:00 New Zealand time. A few hours beforehand, I said, intelligence mates have told me the tanks roll at this time. No, it's not going to happen. Sure enough. Again, when dictators say what they're going to do,
Believe them.
believe them.
The thing with China and Taiwan that I always find, and this again is interesting from perspective listening to you as a ex-national MP. My father was the president of the National Party for a number of years. And I can remember when I was a teenager, the phone ringing, it'd be some Asian guy. And I was used to Asian people ringing up the house because Dad had his business in textiles, and a lot of his companies that he represented were in Taiwan or Korea or Japan and things like that. So I was used to it, So at one moment I'll just get my father and I'd go and get Dad. And it'd be the Chinese ambassador or the Chinese consul ringing up to tell my father that he needed to tell the Prime Minister that the National Party needed to stop going to the National Day of Taiwan, that they couldn't say this about, they can't even mention Taiwan, you can't say Republic of China, you're not allowed to do this. And I can remember my father very patiently, more patient than me, is unbelievably patient compared to me. I'm not patient. And he would explain to the Chinese consul or ambassador that we lived in a democratic country. We were entitled to say and do whatever we pleased within the bounds of the law. And we weren't going to be dictated to by communist dictators.
Yep.
Thank you for your comment. Goodbye.
I like your dad. Your dad was a good man, and actually he was very good to me when I was first entering Parliament. I used to get similar calls. So I used to chair the Foreign Affairs and Defence and Trade Committee for a number of years. And as I got more vocal on the China question, particularly I spoke out, first time it ever happened, the chairs of the committees in the UK, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand, we all signed a joint letter which condemned what was happening in Hong Kong. And that's when, for me, trouble with the Chinese embassy started. But most weeks they would call me and tell me off. And, Mr. O'Connor, you are not to interfere in China's domestic politics. And I would always finish the calls by reminding them very politely that, well, thank you for your call, but of course you're interfering in my country's politics by calling me. But they would dutifully call most weeks and tell me off for something I'd supposedly done. But we've got to just keep speaking up. And you mentioned Taiwan. Can I just quickly add this ad that Helen Clark and others put in the paper egregiously said two things which we just really need to highlight. One was that basically China is owned by Taiwan, and so we should just let Taiwan go. I mean, a gross misrepresentation.
Taiwan's owned by China.
Yeah. The whole one China policy, which, really succinctly, New Zealand says, yep, we understand there is one China. We understand that the communists believe they own Taiwan. We understand that's what you think. We don't. Taiwan is its own democratic country. Thank you very much. The other thing was Helen and others were calling for the Prime Minister to stop members of Parliament travelling to the likes of Taiwan. One of our most fundamental rights as a politician is to be able to freely move about. I visited Taiwan. I've been to all sorts of places. You never want the Prime Minister, even of your own party, telling you where you cannot and cannot go. I mean, it's just outrageous, the idea that the Prime Minister could stop MPs doing what they need to do.
And that's what John Key did. That's the thing. Like I use that story of Dad telling the Chinese ambassador or consul general to go fly a kite, because just a few short years later, it's not that long, we've got a change in the stance of the National Party. I can remember going into Maurice Williamson's office when he was the MP there, and two of his staff were just changing their pin on their jacket because it was the Taiwanese National Day, and they were changing their pin. It was a KMT pin, Kuomintang pin, and because they were going to the national. Well, MPs have been told ever since the John Key years, you can't go to those events anymore.
Well, it was one of the reasons I used to get into trouble, because I would tell them to get stuffed.
Yeah.
It was one of I think the first MP, or at least one of the very early ones, to start going to the Tiananmen square memorials that we had. And yeah, attending Taiwan events, going to Taiwan, speaking actually about the Uyghurs, talking about the house Christians, condemning what's happening in Hong Kong. But you're dead right. The internal political pressures to silence, which is why credit to, I think, Stuart Smith, and there was, by the way, MPs from across the House. I just can't remember all the others. They went to Taiwan recently. We've had MPs from across the House visit the Dalai Lama and Dar es Salaam. This is a good thing. Even if you don't agree with them, these MPs are allowed to and should be allowed to travel. And these political parties, it's the problem of MMP, Cam, as you know, is centralising the power more and more now. And you don't really have these MPs operating as individuals. They're just automatons of the party leadership.
Well, seeing as you've brought that up, let's talk about MMP. You're a victim of MMP, right? And the National Party pretty much chucked you under the bus. It might not be your word.
Freeing. It's so free and everything has a silver lining.
Yeah, I mean, I've always said that you're out of politics when your phone stops ringing.
It is true, and it literally is a cliff. A number of, no names will be mentioned, but a number of colleagues have obviously left Parliament while I was there, from choosing to leave to losing, scandal. Some that I've kept in contact with haven't coped with that silence, and I wondered. So on election night, about 8:15 p.m, I knew I'd lost and turned to Rachel, my wife, and said, "I was stuffed," and it was like a switch. But I did have, as in, we're done, not too fussed or not too upset, worried for my staff and everything, but it was like, it's time to move on. But at the same time, I wondered, gosh, I wonder how I am going to react. How long does it take for the text messages and phone calls and emails to stop?
It's instant, eh?
Instant. When you get lots of texts, sorry, and upset, and how you going, and all of that. But yeah,
the day after, that's it.
Yeah, and that surprised me. I thought, I'd be maybe a day or two. It'd be clear. I loved it then, the quiet, and I love it now. I don't miss it. Some colleagues do. Some find it really hard. And maybe I could just put it this way. For me, being a politician has never been my identity. It was just a job I did. I enjoyed it, loved being there, loved being out. But for some colleagues across both sides of the House, being an MP was who they were. And now that they're not, they still struggle even after years. I mean, everyone's different.
Yeah, everyone is different. But MMP, I think, has a lot to answer for the situation that New Zealand finds itself in now, philosophically even, politically and economically. The way I see it is MMP has given power to the parties that exceeds that which the people who voted for MMP ever envisaged the party should ever have. And we were sold the line that MMP would bring in, peace, love, and mung beans, that parties would be forced to work together to get anything done. And in fact, it actually I think it increased polarization, that you have two large entrenched parties that have between 25 and 35% on any given day. You've got a couple of hangers on the left and the right, that get, a small percentage, but never enough to significantly impact the major party, which means that those smaller parties then get suffocated in government. We've seen a change, though, since 2023. We've seen a huge change, because what we're seeing now is that those minor parties got a little bit more than they've normally enjoyed, and the National Party got less than it normally enjoys. And therefore, it's had to work more collaboratively with those two minor parties, to the extent where New Zealand First is a classic example, where we're at midterm and they're polling at or about what they polled during the election. And traditionally, they've fallen below 5% during the election. Everyone's going, "Oh, he's finished this time. Winston's finished this."
Oh, I say that, and they always get it wrong.
Oh, I used to be like that. Where the National Party has spent 35 years hating Winston Peters, and now I always used to say, one day you're going to have to work with him. But thankfully, most of the people who hated on Winston are gone, and so you haven't got that same anathema there.
Well, it's one of the reasons, and was it 2017 when the negotiations went for National the wrong way, is they sent some of the wrong people in.
Yeah,
Winston, I mean, you know him better than I do, but Winston, if you will, holds grudges. He remembers people who haven't been too kind. So, sending someone like Paula Bennett in to negotiate. That's not a smart move, So
They should have got Todd McLean
someone like Todd, absolutely.
because his father's very close to Winston, right? And it's those personal relationships that have stood the test of time. That's how you negotiate with Winston Peters. I mean, the guy is a bit of a narcissist, like all politicians, right? But he's been there so long, he deserves actually to be respected. And so going to negotiations with an attitude like Bill English had and Paula Bennett had was disrespectful. And that's why the negotiation, people say, oh, Winston chose Jacinda Ardern, which is a pathetic argument because the smaller coalition partner always has to make that decision at some point in time. It wasn't that Jacinda made a better deal, because would John Key have given a provincial growth fund to Winston Peters? In a New York second, he would have, right, to make the deal happen. But Bill English's pride and intransigence and selecting the wrong people to negotiate disrespected Winston Peters to the point where a deal was not possible, despite key members of his caucus and team saying, for God's sake, do the deal, Bill.
Oh, and that's dead right. I mean, talking to some of the New Zealand First guys, they would have preferred to come with national.
They all did. I've spoken to all of them.
But the key, I wouldn't want to overegg it by saying it was just the people who went in, but I think there was a hubris that didn't help. I remember being in caucus when they came in the morning with the potential deal. Winston was going to decide at 6 o'clock. But I remember turning to a colleague and I said, we're stuffed. He said, well, what do you mean? There's a whole lot of good things here. And I said, yeah, but I can agree with 90% of them, which means this is no negotiation. I mean, that was my background before Parliament. So I mean, looking at not political negotiations, but you look at it going, if you're sitting there in a negotiation, you agree 90%, you're screwed. And sure enough, at 6 o'clock, but I remember I was hosting some function in Parliament that night, but I was pretty much one of the only national MPs left in the Parliament. And what was striking, and why I want to share this, it's not about the MPs. My office ended up filled with National Party staffers and EAs. I didn't have enough drinks in the office, but they all just piled in, a lot in tears and shock. And why I wanted to share that is, when governments lose, they're the MPs, the staff, it's just instantly they've lost their jobs. And I'm sad it happened, but I was pleased to be there. It became quite a long night. I think we restocked drinks and chats and lots of talking. My previous life and career, I think, came in handy, a bit of pastoral support.
I've got some insights from both sides of those negotiations, and Bill English's demeanor during the negotiations was one of boredom, one of disinterest. A couple of things were suggested, and Bill English at one point said to Winston across the table that he'd rather piss in his cup of tea and drink it than do that. This is the sort of stuff that went on in the negotiations that many people are not aware of.
Well, even so, I have to say, someone like myself, but if those are the attitudes, or someone goes in, again, it doesn't even matter if it's political negotiations. If you go in thinking you just hold all the cards in a negotiation, you're going to come generally out badly. That's the whole point of a negotiation, is a bit of respect in a two-way.
And see, they learnt that off John Key, ironically. Like, he was in a superior position because he literally did hold all the cards. With a over 40% vote, he didn't really have to. He only negotiated because he had to, but realistically, if you're a smaller party, you don't get much, and you've only got 5% of the vote, you really don't get a lot to say.
Well, that's why your earlier point's the right one, is these parties that used to be on the fringe, who've come on slightly mainstream, now have enough percentage that actually they do demand, as has happened with this coalition, a lot of respect. And it'll be interesting to see. Personally, I think we will see more fracturing. National and Labour have sort of fallen back to their absolute diehard core supporters. There's a lot of disquiet out there on the national side. I come across a lot of people or former National now who won't sign up to the party, not sure where to vote, but the same's true of Labourites. They're not sure because they don't recognise in those two mainstream parties.
In the Labour Party, it's easier to see the fracturing, right? Because you've got a large Maori caucus there. They got used to under Ardern stamping their foot and performing a haka literally in the caucus room
And getting what
they want. And Willie Jackson has not realised the reality of the political situation that he's faced, where most New Zealanders are sick of that. We reached peak Maori, that's what I like to call it, peak Maori, quite some time ago, and we're over it. The Maori Party clearly have the same attitude, and Labour is faced with a real possibility that their Maori MPs may decamp and go to Te Pāti Maori. It'll ultimately be futile because cutting up less than 50% of the cake does not give you 50% of the cake, right?
It's a real
And
possibility.
by making Labour more dependent on the Maori Party makes them less appealing to middle New Zealand.
I think it's going to be, at this point, probably the big political aspect of the campaign next year. You could imagine it from National. I've got no particular insights. It's that I've sort of stepped back from politics in many ways. But I think a lot of their thing will be, look, if you vote for Labour, you're voting for these, Te Pāti Maori radicals.
But I'm not sure Luxon's strong enough to make that point. Of course, Winston will. He'll make that point all day long.
Oh, Winston will, and I suppose a little bit like how the coalition's gone. Luxon allows these guys to run the lines. He's not really an out front.
He can't get away with saying the things that Winston and Shane Jones can, so he lets them say it. But politically, that's costing him votes.
And it costs him votes in two ways, because one, of course, he is in Luxon and National's not saying it. The other is that Winston, and I'm happy to be corrected on this because you know I'm better, but he's going to start sort of flexing his voice and muscles in the coming months. There's a reason he was happy to be DPM in the first half.
Exactly.
He's going to make sure that he and New Zealand First survives, and that will be distinguishing himself from this coalition government. And he will delight in causing David Seymour and ACT trouble and National. I mean, it's Winston.
But, I mean, David Seymour and ACT have got it coming. They ran the entire campaign at the last election against Winston Peters, right? It was hilarious. Like, I mean, this is the thing that gets me. If we just go back again to 2017, when Bill English lost the negotiations, right? I say through intransigence and rudeness, and you've added some extra insights about the wrong people negotiating. But National had this overriding belief that they had a right to govern, that Winston Peters had made a mistake, that the voting public would realise that he had made a mistake, and the public would realise they had made a mistake in giving Labour an increased percentage, and that come the 2020 election, that the normal course of events would take hold and that they would be back in power after only one term. Now, of course, they completely ignore history, right? That there's only been one-term government. There's never been, there's not even been a two-term government under MMP. We've allowed 3 terms, and that's about as good as you get. And ironically, it was I can't even remember now somebody told me, Maori politician told me, that by and large, New Zealanders have this sense of fairness, that if you do all right, and we treat politics like a game of two halves. 3 years is the first half, and if you did all right in the first half, at the election we'll give you the second half of the game, and you get to have 6 years. And if you do all right at that, you can have another half of the next game, but by that time
We want to change.
And so Holyoake was the last 4-term government. And John Key stupidly thought that he was going to be able to have a 4-term government, that he was going to beat Keith Holyoake in tenure as the longest serving Prime Minister. He was going to beat Holyoake as tenure as the longest serving National Prime Minister. He failed in all regards in that because he forgot his history. And that's what National did again. In 2017, they thought it'll be 1 term and we'll be back in.
I remember being part of those. I mean, to lift the lid a little bit, there were lots of discussions, not just in caucus, but in passing. And I can't give you a ratio or a split, but there were certainly those MPs who are very much of that. This is a mistake. The voters got it wrong. They'll realise. And then others of us who are saying the voters are always right.
They are.
You don't have to agree with them. Obviously, being on the losing side in that election, you didn't agree with where they voted, but they did vote that way. And I think it did impact the way National behaved over that time. It was sort of an assumption that people would see sense. So simply because, yes, we're here. As you know, as we're discussing, that's not how it operates. And part of the dynamic you described should help the coalition in next year's election. People will sort of be more of a potentially, well, we're not that happy, but we'll give them another go. But it's tight at the moment. It's very tight.
Well, what happens in New Zealand elections, and it's happened every election under MMP with one exception, which was 2020, and there were extenuating circumstances for that. But in every election under MMP, the minor parties grow during the election campaign, and the major parties slip back. So look at the polls and where we're sitting now. We've got New Zealand First and ACT that are on about the same as what they were on election night. They haven't slipped back like traditionally they have, which means that come the election in only 18 months' time, we're going to see those smaller parties gain even more. And there's only one way that can go, and that is for the major parties to slide back even further and become a much more diminished and maybe an even under 30% situation for both of them, which means that you're going to be looking at maybe 27, 28 for National, 10 each for ACT and New Zealand First. That's a much stronger bargaining position for ACT and New Zealand First to get the country over the line.
It would almost be like an earthquake. I mean, you've got the initial rumbles happening already, as you say. You are seeing the likes of, it doesn't matter if it's the Green Party, ACT, New Zealand First, actually getting a much bigger chunk of the vote. But I think you're right. If these parties grow even further at the expense of the big ones, it'll be a seismic shift in politics because it will no longer be these two dominant parties. They will have to rely even more on their coalition partners. But, National, I remember being in, I've forgotten what the years were, I should know. It was after, obviously, it might have been the 2020 elections. Colleagues, when we were polling in the 40s, running about, traumatized in the hallways of Parliament, and now they're scraping in the low to mid 30s. It's like, for me personally, I've always had strong views on things. They just have to have a clear vision on things. It's one of the reasons, Hipkins is struggling on the left as well. What do you stand for?
Well, what do you stand for exactly? The Labour Party, again, it's easy. They used to stand for the workers, right? Very simple. We're for the workers. Now, you've got to say they really aren't. If anyone's for the workers, it's probably Winston Peters. And he's making that pitch strongly for the blue-collar workers that there are in New Zealand. The Labour Party seems to be for whoopsies and weirdos and all of these small, tiny little percentages of the population.
They're getting caught up with that identity politics. That, ironically, as they scream about culture wars, they're the ones adopting them. But, National's getting caught up on some of...
Yeah, because they're woke. That's why.
It's a real challenge. I mean, it's easy for me to sit here, post-politics.
So you're allowed to.
They've just got to have a clear articulate, and principles. And maybe that's the key. If you've got your core principles, you can always ground yourself in them. Once you start putting those principles to the side, and we've touched on some of them.
But when was the last time we had a principled politician leading this country? When? I mean, Helen Clark had some principles. I don't agree with them, but she kind of stuck to those. She did nothing really as Prime Minister. I mean, there's no signature things that she did that everyone can hang their hat on and say, oh, she was great. John Key's the same. He had no principles at all other than winning the next election. That was John Key's driver. He wanted three things in life. He wanted a knighthood, he wanted to be the longest serving national prime minister, and he wanted to be to get a fourth term. Well, getting a fourth term was nigh on impossible, although in hindsight, if he had stayed on and done a deal with Winston, he would have. He was never
Hindsight's a wonderful thing, isn't it?
Yeah, in order to be the longest serving national prime minister, he was going to have to win the fourth term and go the whole length of that and across into the next one to beat Keith Holyoake. It was never going to happen. And so all he ended up with was he failed on the flag change as well, and all he ended up was a knighthood.
Yeah, I don't think Key was impressed. I was quite vocal in my opposition to the flag change, not because I was particularly devoted to the current flag. I just thought all the alternatives were crap.
I remember talking to John Key about it, and I said to him, you're going to lose this. And he said, why? And I said, because the Labour Party's going to come out and oppose it. And he says, oh, it's in their manifesto that they want a flag change. I said, they'll forget that. The moment you come out and say you want to change the flag, they'll ditch the manifesto and they'll oppose the flag, and you'll be fighting them on the flag. And there's other things that you can fight them on that are a much better proposition.
Yeah, I always thought it was a waste of time. I mean, colleagues knew that, spoke about it quite frankly. And, what happened predictably, of course, is years afterwards, when constituents came in with all array of query, it was always, well, you found 26 million for a flag referenda. And, the internal voice said one thing, which was like, yes, you're right. Externally, you had to try and make excuses, but it was a rod made for the government's back amongst many things. But I think you're right, just jumping to the wider, it is hard to identify, certainly in my political memory, some of you could say there's a totally principled Prime Minister. Clark probably gets the closest because, I don't agree with much of what she stands for, but you knew where she sat.
It was wonky, but she did have principles.
We had a predict where she'd go.
Yeah, but John Key didn't have any principles. We were governed by focus groups, basically.
I wouldn't fully agree with that insofar. I think he did have principles. There were some bottom lines, but you're also right. He was very much right. Well, this is where the popular push is. We're just going to go. And that, I can't speak to it, but there were many robust discussions in caucuses. And again, people can critique me on this, but I believe I hold to principles and things that I believe in and would speak to those.
Yeah.
Which always sort of adds to a bit of a rub. And it's getting harder in an MMP environment because at the end of the day, MMP concentrates pretty much all the power in the party leader. The party and then the party leader. And it might be one or two or three people, that kitchen cabinet type dynamic. And, you're told time and time again about unity, unity, unity. And so if an MP is saying something different, if an MP has a different view on a topic, if you are distracting even from the leader of the day, so you might not be doing anything wrong per se, but the fact that you're getting some media time and they're not becomes a problem.
Yeah.
And so in many ways, not to be too dramatic, you don't really have a parliament of 120 MPs. You have a parliament effectively governed by five parties, and then of course that becomes more proportionate to who's in power. And then a lot of frustrated MPs because they are generally, on all sides of the House, generally good people. They really want to do the best. They've got their ideas, and they just get frustrated at every turn because it's not what the party leader wants.
It's interesting. You've raised a couple of times how free you feel not being an MP. And you just now alluded to that being tightly controlled by the party or the party leader. Do you feel freer now? I mean, we've got provisions in our laws that say you can say whatever you want in Parliament. You have the absolute right to freedom of speech inside Parliament. And yet it's not really used.
No, it's not. It's the irony. I've said it to a few people. I am, as you've touched on, I'm freer now to be me and say and think what I want than I was in Parliament. And it's a terrible irony because you're right. Parliament comes with age-old privileges, as we call them, that protects the ability to speak. And so in theory, you're as a MP, you're very privileged. You're very fortunate. You should be able to say and think whatever you want, but you can't. And let's be clear, you're not being taken out the back and roughed up. But, it's uncomfortable to be
Unless you're in the Labour Party.
Unless in the Labour Party, that's right. Or Trevor and Tao.
Or mega fightery.
Yeah, I know. But, it's always uncomfortable to be dragged into the leader's office or into the press secretary's team and bollocksed. Even as an MP, you just don't like it. And, even at your heart, as someone I suspect I was perceived as a bit rogue on a number of issues, was you don't want to harm your party. You know that you're there for your colleagues. You do understand, and I certainly understand that unity is important. But at times it gets very, very difficult. Doesn't matter if you're on conscience issues like matters of life for me, which I'm, unapologetically strong on, or even like questions of China. It's like, well, I'm sorry, I can't be allowed to be silenced just because someone else in the party has a different view.
You can't take the Groucho Marx, position, which is principles. No, if you don't like these ones, they've got plenty more.
But this is actually where a lot of, I think, modern populist politics is going. I'm careful that word populist because, of course, if you're not popular, you don't get elected.
But why this is the funny thing, right? Winston Peters is described as a populist leader, and it's used as a slight. an insult.
It is, and I think even in using it, you can see my hesitation.
Yeah.
This comes back to what we said right at the start, is that manipulation of language. Because you're right, being popular is a good thing. When we were all at school, we wanted to be popular. To get elected, you need to be popular, but it has become a slight that somehow you're sort of right-leaning and might push back against some of these cultural mores.
And on that freedom of speech, we're supposed to have this is how it's supposed to work in a liberal democracy. We have a media and they say the words, they say it often, that they're there to speak truth to power.
Hmm.
And yet what we're seeing from our media is there's this homogenized view of what can be talked about and what can't be talked about. And you wrote an op-ed for Stuff and they refused to publish that.
Oh, yeah. Not the first time.
But I republished that
Which I was grateful. Well, I saw the spike on my Substack. That's Cam.
the Cam effect. What was the main message that you wanted to convey, and how did you feel when Stuff? Did they even respond and say no, or did they just ignore it?
Just ignored it. I mean, look, I don't know the exact reason. It's quite possible that, the person in the inbox missed it. My suspicion, it just didn't fit the narrative. So it was on the Israel question. It was responding to Phil Goff, and I won't bore your listeners with going into detail. But
Why not? We've got time.
We got to all of them. Goff put out a very emotive piece in support of, I would argue, sort of
It was just wrong, though.
Well, I thought his view was wrong, but what particularly struck me...
Well, factually wrong, though.
Factually wrong, amongst many things, like he'd claimed that Netanyahu was a war criminal.
Been found guilty.
Which is not the case. You can debate him, but, get the facts right. But what struck me the most, and what effectively I wrote back to Stuff, was he never once, not once, did Goff, as in Phil Goff, mention October 7, like the key traumatic catalyst for what's happening in the Middle East at the moment. He completely and utterly ignored, as well as I would argue, or did argue, that he played down Hamas. So all the stuff on Israel. So what I wrote, very considered, but about 700 words pointing that out, and also making the point that I'm a former politician, I'm a former chair of foreign affairs, and I've just been to Israel. I would suggest a good counter, but crickets, silence.
So they let Phil Goff speak, but they won't let someone who speaks in opposition to what Phil Goff has said.
Yeah, and I don't know for sure, but I'm
Phil
sure
Goff. I'm sure you've seen the photographs of him with Yasser Arafat walking out of a meeting, holding hands with them, like jolly hockey sticks. We're good mates, and all of that sort of thing. I mean, Phil Goff's worldview has never changed since his Vietnam protest days, when he was spitting in veterans' faces, throwing paint on them all. Does he think that we've forgotten that's what he was like, a long-haired hippie lout who protested against everything basically that the West believes, who ended up being in foreign affairs in government, but still towing that line, this belief that Israel doesn't have a right to exist, that the PLO, as it was in those days, Fatah as it is now, and all of those proxies of Iran have this unfettered right to wage war against a sovereign nation and not expect retaliation, that the Israelis have to be the bigger people and not retaliate, and then we'll have peace. It's a motherhood and apple pie view of foreign affairs that doesn't bear any resemblance to reality.
No, it's got no real politic in it whatsoever. I mean, look, he's welcome to his opinion. I had no problem that Stuff ran his piece.
No,
I was just surprised that there was no counter. To be fair, Damien Grant,
that was
his
a great
regular
piece.
column, and it's not to take away from it because it was a great piece by Damien, but it was a regular column. He was able to, I suspect, I don't know, but he was able to leverage being the regular columnist. Like, I'm sure others would have responded to Phil, said it was so egregious to not mention, as I say, October 7, to not even say anything about Hamas that was negative, and yet not published. But I think the key takeaway, and I've talked about this in my podcasts and the like, that mainstream media too many negatives. Mainstream media not only has a very left-wing bias, and as you mentioned earlier, that's clear. But they are genuinely censoring alternative views. So they feed you a very particular diet of news on particular
Yeah,
topics.
it's anti-Trump, it's pro climate change, it's pro anti-Israel, I'd
Think about
say.
that later. I mean, it's a horrid thing to even think about, but another child death up north.
Mm.
Barely any coverage here in mainstream media. Another little baby killed, and a little bit of incidental reporting, but very, very little. And it's like, why are you not reporting this?
Well, I mean, you just look at the way they report things. If the person that they're interviewing is Maori for the story, we get a little bracket after their name and their tribal affiliations. We don't see bracket Swedish or bracket Danish or,
Yeah.
you know, after or my clans. My family originated in Scotland, all the clans, my mother's side was part of the Hay clan, my father's side was part of the McInnes clan. We don't see, Cameron Slater bracket, Hay, comma, McInnes, closed bracket. It's this manipulation of the news to give this, again, a warped view of the world that doesn't exist in reality.
And I think a lot of people pick up on it, but it's why I think it's great, that media personalities like yourself and others keep drawing attention. Because as you say, well, why do we need this detail here? I know when I was, I wasn't in the media often. I don't say it with any anger or frustration. I suppose a little bit is that, again, you're quite often speaking to media, trying to engage, but you just don't get published. I mean, constituents, you just say, oh, we never hear about what you're doing. It's like, I'm writing pieces, I'm seeking interviews, but they choose not to. But when they did, more often than not, there was always a prefix, conservative MP Simon O'Connor, or
Mm.
former trainee priest Simon O'Connor. Perfectly accurate, but they rarely do that of, shock jock, former shock jock.
Right wing
Well,
blogger Cameron Slater.
exactly.
Yeah.
It'll be very interesting when if people take the time over even the next week, read the news of how they will choose. And I notice it too on the Māori issues. For those who are Māori and very much buy into sort of the Te Pāti Māori narrative, they're always just described as Maori. So your Willie Jacksons, obviously, there are really Waitatis. When it came to the national MPs who were Maori, they were often just described by legacy media as identify as Maori. Because of their politics, because they went...
You're the wrong kind of Maori.
They're the wrong kind of Maori. But it was, again, just that subtle use of language, and it is manipulation. And so the more we talk about it, the better, because it shines a bit of sunlight on what the media is doing.
Well, they're not fair players.
Oh, God, no.
They are literally tilting the field in the way that they see fit. And that's why you're seeing a disconnect with people who follow the mainstream media all the time, the people who still watch the 6 o'clock news, even though, I haven't watched it in probably 15 years, more than that. I only watch it when I'm on it.
I watched it last week. I was cooking in the kitchen and I was bored. So, and did want to see, I was wanting to see how New Zealand was reporting what was occurring in the Middle East and who they were using. But yeah, look, it's only a political observation from me, but, I think the coalition government from day one's been absolutely pummeled by the media. For all the critiques we can have, and I can have, of what the coalition's doing, Luxon hasn't really had a day where they're not attacking him. And it's the same for Seymour and for Winston. Just the media's day after day hammering them. They can do no right.
We haven't really seen, too, with the media, any embracing of issues around freedom of speech. A classic example is the Portia Mao win. Again, we're back to the CCP manipulating things, right? We are using the laws of this country to silence dissent in a foreign country. That should be all over the media, and yet it's not.
Oh, remarkably not. I mean, Portia Mao is a New Zealander of Chinese ancestry, a wonderful woman. I've dealt with her a lot with my what they call IPAC, the Interparliamentary Alliance of China. Work very closely with her. She speaks Mandarin, which is great. Been able to give her information, and she's just been great. I really like Portia. But yeah, she was being trolled effectively and harassed by a guy called Morgan Zhao. He used to be a local Labour candidate, I think, out south. and currently works for the Auckland Council. Long and short, he started attacking her on WeChat, equivalent of ours.
Yeah.
Well, you know what it is. But long and short, as she was putting out her news or stating things, he took exception, and it got really quite nasty, particularly him to her. Well, she got in contact with me months and months ago. I was the one who put her onto the Free Speech Union, because she got in contact with me and said, Simon, this guy Morgan Zhao, he's got an ex parte ruling from the court under New Zealand's Harmful Digital Communications Act that I'm not allowed to speak anymore about him and around what's happening with the CCP in New Zealand. And I thought, that can't be right. I said to Portia, really? Did you not get contacted? I said, it's probably fake. I mean, I'd never heard of ex parte. But I said, let me go and read up on a few things and make a few inquiries. Long and short, she was 100% correct. This guy, who was harassing her and trying to stop her, went to a New Zealand court under the Harmful Digital Communications Act, which National passed, and used it to get basically a block on her. And she didn't have to go to court.
No, that's why it's ex parte.
Yeah, I
They
didn't know
went
what
and
that
did it, sat there with obviously a judge who knew nothing about how things operate, was fed a particular line, didn't have, I mean, if I was the judge and I had someone come with an ex parte, I said, oh, I'll tell you what, let's set a date in 2 weeks' time and we'll hear the other side of the story, shall we?
It was just, look, I remember, I was in National when the law was passed. I remember being very uncomfortable, and please, this is not sort of romantic looking back. I voted for it, the party voted for it, but I remember in caucus saying something's just not quite right here. I didn't know what it was going to be. I didn't know Portia at that time, but it's the insidious element of when these supposedly good laws are put in, they get misused. And there's a couple of things to take from the Portia case. Well, firstly, as I say, she was right. I still am stunned that someone can go to a judge and the judge just takes their side without talking to the other. But I said to her, go to the Free Speech Union and got her in touch with Jonathan Aileen and the crew. And they've done an amazing job, and they've backed her and fought and won. But there's two takeaways on top of all of this. One, the CCP operates in this country. I mean, you and I know it.
They've got their own police stations here.
They do, at least 2, potentially 5. It was myself and Larissa Wall who broke that news, and the government just clammed up around that. We were also the ones who leaked the Solomon Islands agreement to China, and again, everyone froze up, including the opposition. We even released all the weaponry which was being imported into the Solomons, heavy weapons, released all that information, crickets. But they operate here, and, looks to me that someone like a Morgan Zhao is being, pushed and led.
Oh, there's plenty of those little functionaries that do that here. Yeah. They belong to other political parties. They belong to the National Party. They belong to the Labour Party. They get into these positions either on local councils and things like that, and then they use the title that comes with it. It's why they seek to be justices of the peace and things like that. It's to put a veneer of authenticity around what they do, but what they're actually working for is for a foreign government. They're actually spies.
They are. And, I would say, and it's one, it was one of my, I suppose, key contentions and arguments with my colleagues is, for me, national security and sovereignty are most important. Trade is important. All of that's important. But our national security and sovereignty. And as someone who's been particularly targeted, my emails were targeted by the CCP. I've got a bit of skin in this game. And maybe it affects my judgment, but, we are being interfered with. But the second point is the CCP operatives know our laws better than we do. And the Portia Mao case illustrates that. They knew how to manipulate the harmful digital communications. And it reminded me just quickly, Cam, a couple of years ago when I was chairing Foreign Affairs, was talking to some of our intelligence guys, and they were saying the same thing. I said, well, why are you not doing this? Because they were briefing me on different things that were happening, how Chinese New Zealanders get harassed by CCP thugs. I said, well, why don't you just arrest them? And that was their point. These guys know the New Zealand law.
They're operating within the New Zealand
law. They know
law.
exactly just to push right up to the line and then pull back, which is why, the government's working on foreign interference legislation, which is good, but it's so needed. But we just, again, naive on this. We just don't want to talk about it often.
But you see attempts to do something about it fail because of a lack of understanding of New Zealand law, even by the authorities that are supposed to uphold the New Zealand law. So if you look at the Serious Fraud Office prosecutions of the National and Labour Party people with round donations, what many New Zealanders don't understand, because of the poor way that the Serious Fraud Office prosecuted that, the inappropriate use of the Crimes Act to deal with political donations, meant that we didn't actually hear the full story about where all of those donations came from. All we heard was the people were involved at a certain level in laundering that cash. But my understanding is a lot of the evidence that was produced in those court cases, and one Labor person who was prosecuted still has name suppression around that. And all of the trails of that money led back to the CCP, and CCP controlled organizations out of China. And it never came up in the trials because the SFO used the wrong act to prosecute everybody. They tried it with the New Zealand First and failed as well on that. Because it's like the Health Act. The Health Act under COVID was turned inside out and upside down and used to sequester the entire population in their homes, when the Health Act was only designed to sequester sick people in their homes. And we saw this with the SFO prosecutions. They looked at the Crimes Act instead of the Electoral Finance Act, and they used the Crimes Act to try and shoehorn political mismanagement or deviousness into being an actual crime, and they couldn't prove it. And that's why they all got off and all walked away. But the sad part is we didn't find out the full details of where that money came from, because it didn't come from those individuals, that's for certain.
No, I have to say, I mean, I'm aware of the case or cases. I'm no expert in them. I have to say there's just so many things going on. But I will agree in general, not in every case, but yeah, there's a lot of money that effectively gets laundered from the CCP. It doesn't turn up in a brown paper bag outside a party headquarters. It's coming through, as you say, these associations, organizations,
Functions,
hardware,
wine being sold. Yeah.
And it's a fraught one, because by and large, what I've observed and the ones that I have called out is nothing illegal, which does raise a question around our laws. But you can see what's happening here. And the other observation, and it's something that challenges me as a former MP, is that actually we're not writing and drafting the laws well enough. In fact, I'd make the argument the MPs are running around like headless chooks with almost too much to do. So often laws are being passed where, look at how many amendment bills are needed. Why? Because something's wrong with the original. It's been rushed through, hasn't been considered. The minister hasn't really looked at it. They've just taken their officials' advice. The MPs are, as I say, rushed and tired, haven't interrogated it. But we're not also taking into account this judicial activism, which, was it the privilege? There was a privileges. We had to change the privileges law a few years ago because an activist judge decided that he had or she had a novel interpretation. You've seen it around, is it the Marine and Coastal Act and a whole lot of other ones. It's like, well, the parliamentarians pretty much knew what they had written down, but then the judges have been like acrobats and come out with new interpretations. So we've got structural problems as well we have to address.
Still touching on China, I have this real opposition to politicians doing things on TikTok and, silly little stunts and things like that. Last week we saw Christopher Luxon out there with it's actually a poor manipulation using AI, but it was official, right? It was Christopher Luxon and Erica Stanford standing there, and there was an AI translation into Mandarin and another one in Hindi, explaining the changes to our immigration laws and how you can now bring your parents here. And yes, there's a whole lot of criteria and all that. But the entire things were in Mandarin and in Hindi. And now we've got Luxon off up to China. I detect the National Party sucking up to China again. And I know from my peer group, and not all of them are National Party supporters, some are saying to me, why the hell is Christopher Luxon pandering to the parents of Uber drivers, to be crass about it, instead of dealing with some of the issues that are affecting all New Zealanders? I mean, literally, like, who cares about parents of immigrants coming here, really?
I can see why they've done it, but at the same time, I'm not sure it's going to have the impact they hope. Look, I think unfortunately the government is pandering to China. I mean, let's be clear. I'm all for trading with China. I think we need to be diversifying away from China.
Don't put all your eggs in one basket.
We can't. I mean, we should have learnt that from,
The
EU. Exactly right. And was it 72? Not that I was around.
That was calamitous for New Zealand, but we had all our eggs in one basket.
Yep. So we've got to move away from that dependence on China. I suppose what I would want to see is more robustness. There'll be a nominal mention of human rights at the sit down. I mean, I've been at some of these fora where the minister will read out, a set piece. But you know what? China,
It's all agreed beforehand.
It's all agreed beforehand, but we need to be more robust. I say it this way. We don't need to walk up to China and punch them in the face. That's not particularly smart for a whole lot of reasons. But when New Zealand's national interests keep being made secondary to just money, 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 I think we've got a major problem. And China is a major problem. They interfere in this country. They interfere into the Pacific Islands. There's constant threats. These are not good people. And what I mean by that is the CCP. Chinese people in China are the first victims of that autocratic regime. I just want to see more robustness from New Zealand around these questions, but I doubt it's going to be there. It's all about smiling faces and photo ops and money, and that's not principled.
No, it's not principled at all. It's almost like prostrating yourself to the gods of money. China is a large economy. They have a malign influence in the Pacific. I was born in Fiji. I see the influence that China has in Fiji, and it's not good.
No.
There's wonky buildings being built. I mean, the tallest building in Suva is this new hotel, and it developed a lien.
Go to the Cook Islands, and they've built the police and justice precinct. I mean, there's always reasons for this. No, it's not a good influence, and that's why we've got to speak up about it and push back against it. And that's what I want to see. The other thing is I'd never used TikTok. In fact, it was one of the things I was working on before I left. I was actually in communication with TikTok. Not sure the party knew, demanding to know where all our data was going, and basically TikTok wouldn't confirm. Because New Zealanders have to wake up. I mean, pretty much any device, but TikTok harvests enormous amounts of your information and is part of the CCP propaganda tool. And yet here our politicians gleefully use it. It's a security risk. As I said, it's an app I don't use. I encourage my stepkids do not put it on their phone. I don't police it. They're adults, but it's just don't use it.
People are unaware of the pervasive nature of Chinese interference in our economy, whether it's Huawei, putting devices in for our mobile networks. There is an ulterior motive, and if we're not honest about saying that, then we are opening our economy up to economic sabotage. That can happen very quickly indeed, should China decide to do that.
Oh, absolutely.
And I agree we should be trading with China, but we should be trading with integrity.
Well, often it's with open eyes, and we should still be able to call out what's happening. We don't. We go quiet. We sort of vacillate on the topics. You can see the MPs and the ministers squirm anytime China is mentioned, and that has to stop. We have to put New Zealand's national security sovereignty first.
Do you think Luxon's going to have any impact in China with his visit, or is it just a glad-handing exercise where he gets to, stand next to Xi and shake his hand, and we achieve actually little from that?
I think we'll achieve little from it. It'll be more about the regime they're achieving something from New Zealand, and that'll be twofold. One is it continues to legitimize them. Hey, look, New Zealand's come and paid homage to us. The other is New Zealand is seen as sort of the weaker party in Five Eyes. Disrespectfully, it's four eyes and a blink. And so China's
There might even be a wink.
and China's always very keen to just keep a little bit of distance between New Zealand and the other partners to make our allies like Australia and the UK, US, Canada nervous about where we are. And so, I think China will get more out of this than we will, but Chris will get his photo op, and that's what he's keen on.
Yeah.
I just hope we do see in some readouts that there was some at least robust discussion around everything from Hong Kong to Taiwan.
We can but hope.
We can bid hope. We have to be hopeful.
Yeah. You and I both know that it's just a show pony visit to China for Luxon. And he's going to touch on the G7 as well. We hear this talk often, especially when Helen Clark pipes up, which talks about, New Zealand needs to have an independent foreign policy. What the hell does that even mean? And can we really afford to be non-aligned?
I don't think we can afford to be non-aligned. I think the choice is going to be made for us eventually. So, New Zealand's a little country bobbing about in the ocean. And there is massive geopolitical tensions. Our traditional allies and the likes of China, North Korea, Russia, who's supplying Iran at the moment? It's China. So there's sides to be taken. And I've always argued New Zealand's going to be forced to choose a side. Independent foreign policy, I think, has just been a very naive, weak phrase that gets thrown around. It's a bit like let's have a two-state solution. It sounds okay.
It's a bumper sticker slogan, really.
It is.
Isn't it?
We don't have an independent foreign policy. I gave a talk at a university symposium on this last year and started with this. I said, it was a foreign affairs one. I said, we do not have an independent foreign policy. The fact that you are either wondering what the Americans want of us or you're scared of China means you're not independent. And the fact that New Zealand, for example, won't talk about national security issues, sovereignty issues with China robustly means we're scared of them, which means we're not acting independently. And you also see we're all over the place on things. At one moment, we're sort of supporting this group, then we're not. We align all of a sudden with this group, and then that group. It's not independent. It's all over the place.
It is all over the place, because if you look at the sanctioning of 2 Israeli MPs, that has drawn the attention of the United States. And I can't believe that wily old Winston didn't see that one coming, because he stated publicly that that was MFAT's decision and he went along with it. Well, hang on, mate, you're the minister. There's implications on that, and Marco Rubio put out a statement that specifically named New Zealand and said, this is not on.
I think that's an attempt, I know Marco, not like buddies or whatever, but we were in IPAC together and actually really rate him, and I think you're right to draw out the fact that he particularly mentioned New Zealand. I think this is where New Zealand's independent foreign policy, said with inverted commas, goes awry, is that we sort of hold a somewhat consistent line, but all of a sudden the powers that be feel we just have to sort of go on a completely 180 degree just to show that we're doing things a little bit differently. I just think it's damaging. One of the things in diplomacy and with your allies, they want consistency. They want to know you're always there and saying very similar things. And again, New Zealand just keeps jumping. And I can't help but wonder too, whether there was a bit politic here, whether it was just MFAT or Winston or the further cabinet was like, well, we just need to say something to appease the pro-Hamas crowd for a while or something.
I think that there is an anti-Israel bias in MFAT. I mean, we're still funding UNRWA, for example, despite the obvious evidence, the clear evidence that UNRWA staff participated in October 7.
Oh, I presented that multiple times to MFAT when I chaired the committee. Here's the evidence. Why are we doing this? And they just shuffled around. And look, to be fair on them, the ministers didn't step in again, whether they were blue or red, just says, we're not doing this anymore, because it's beyond doubt that New Zealand taxpayer money is going to, it goes to UNRWA and in turn funds terror materials.
I mean, MFAT adamant that we should not have an embassy in the physical bounds of the state of Israel. This is what most people don't understand. Our ambassador to Israel lives in Turkey, in Ankara.
Which is an insult in itself. And it's also not the right place to have an alternative. We have good diplomatic relationships with the state of Israel. They have an embassy and an ambassador here, and we do not. we do not respond.
It's rude.
It is. It's beyond rude. And look, going to Jerusalem would be a step too far.
Would it?
In Tel
Because the
Aviv.
world didn't collapse when the United States moved their embassy to Jerusalem. Many other countries have moved their embassies to Jerusalem.
Argentina, I think, is.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
so will the world collapse if we all of a sudden set up a tiny mission in an apartment building in Jerusalem? Nah, it won't.
No, well, I think, no, it won't. When I say it's stretched too far, I think for New Zealand, that would just be, in the real politic world, would just be too much for us. But going to Tel Aviv, quite possible. Why would we not?
Yeah, it's ridiculous. But we've covered quite a lot today.
Yes,
Sam,
it's great.
It's been fantastic and a pleasure to have you on. Of course, there's an invite for you for my 20-year event on July the 5th, which you're welcome to come along to, meet all the other guests that have been on the podcast.
I think that would be great. Hard to think 20 years. You must have so many memories and highlights. We're not going to get into it, I'm sure, but it's amazing.
It's so large that I can't be bothered writing the book.
You have to get yourself a ghostwriter.
I think I should. Maybe if Paul Goldsmith retires, he writes a good ghostwriter.
There we go. There's an option for Paul in his future career.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure having you on the Good Oil podcast. Thanks a lot, Simon.
Cam, it's been a real pleasure.
Hey, now welcome to the show, where the wind's blowing strong and the truth can flow. This is the Good Oil. Catch a vibe today with Cam Slater leading us all the way.